Let me paint you a picture of what's happening right now in one of the most volatile stretches of water on the entire planet. One waterway, one choke point, and right now, it is shut. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world, has been declared closed by Iran. Not partially, not symbolically, closed. And if you think that's just a regional story, if you think this is just another Middle East flare-up that doesn't affect your daily life, think again. Because through that strait, before all of this started, flowed roughly 1/5 of the entire world's energy supply. 1/5. Think about that number for a second. That's not a rounding error. That's the global economy's jugular. And right now, somebody's hand is around it. So let's talk about what actually happened, why it happened, and more importantly, what it tells us about where this whole situation is heading. Because there's a lot more going on here beneath the surface than just two countries exchanging fire. Let's start with the immediate events, because this is moving fast and it matters to understand the sequence. The United States military launched fresh strikes on multiple targets inside Iran on orders from President Trump. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a continuation of what appears to be an escalating military campaign. Iran's response came swiftly. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is essentially Tehran's most elite and ideologically committed military force, launched drone strikes on American military infrastructure in the region, specifically targeting air bases in Bahrain and Kuwait. Now here's where it gets interesting. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet. This is America's primary naval headquarters in the entire Gulf region. Striking there isn't just a symbolic gesture. That's going after the operational command structure of American naval power in the Middle East. That's a statement. Then there's Kuwait. 2 air bases targeted there. And on top of all of this, 2 oil tankers trying to move through the Strait of Hormuz were hit. The IRGC said those vessels were attempting to pass through illegally, and then formally declared the entire strait closed until further notice. Now, pause here, because we need to understand what closing the Strait of Hormuz actually means in real terms, not just as a headline. Every single day, tens of millions of barrels of oil pass through that narrow passage. Saudi oil, Emirati oil, Kuwaiti oil, Qatari liquefied natural gas. It all funnels through there on its way to Asia, Europe, and beyond. When Iran says that passage is closed and starts backing that up with drone strikes on tankers, insurance companies start panicking, shipping companies start rerouting or halting sailings entirely, and oil prices start climbing in ways that ordinary people in countries completely unrelated to this conflict begin to feel at the gas pump, in their heating bills, in the price of food. Because energy costs are embedded in everything. Transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, they all run on energy. When energy prices spike, inflation spikes. And inflation doesn't respect borders. So already, before we've even gotten into the deeper geopolitical analysis, you can see how a conflict between the US and Iran in the Persian Gulf is not just a regional problem. It's a global economic event. Now, let's zoom out and talk about how we actually got here, because this didn't come from nowhere. There was a ceasefire in April, weeks of devastating US-Israeli strikes on Iran, Iranian retaliatory attacks across the Gulf, and then an agreement to pause, a ceasefire. And for a while, it appeared that diplomacy might have a chance. There were indirect negotiations happening, back-channel talks aimed at working out some kind of interim agreement that would freeze the hostilities while pushing Iran's nuclear program to a separate, future discussion. Iran was asking for frozen assets to be released and for sanctions relief. The US was asking for guarantees. The conversations were happening. And then everything fell apart again. Why? Well, that's the question worth digging into, because both sides have very different stories about who broke the ceasefire first. From Washington's perspective, or at least from what the Trump administration has said publicly, Iran was stalling, playing games, dragging out negotiations without any real intention of reaching a deal. There's this phrase that was used at the White House. Iran was playing them for suckers. The implication being that Tehran was using the negotiation window to buy time, regroup, resupply, and then resume its aggressive posture once it felt ready. Trump publicly threatened to hit power plants, bridges, and critical infrastructure inside Iran if a deal wasn't signed. He also said Iran had taken too long and would have to pay a price. That's not diplomatic language. That's the language of someone who believes the negotiating window has closed and that military pressure is now the only tool left. From Tehran's perspective, and this is important to understand even if you disagree with it, Iran views itself as the party that has already made enormous sacrifices. Iranian officials have consistently said that Iran never wanted this conflict. They've pointed to the fact that US and Israeli strikes hit infrastructure, housing, and civilian areas. Iranian President Pezeshkian specifically responded to Trump's threats by calling attacks on critical infrastructure a sign of desperation, not strength. Iran framed itself as a nation standing firm against external pressure, which, whether or not you agree with Iranian foreign policy, is a narrative that resonates deeply within Iran and across much of the global South. There's a reason why Iran's messaging has been carefully calibrated to portray itself as the defender of national sovereignty rather than the aggressor. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. Because this isn't a simple two-player game, there's a third actor that has been reshaping the entire conflict from the very beginning, and that's Israel. Understand this. Israel and Iran have been fighting what some analysts describe as a shadow war for years. Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, Iranian support for Hezbollah and Hamas, Israeli intelligence operations inside Iran. This has been going on below the surface for a long time. But after the April ceasefire between the US and Iran, Israel did not stop. Israel continued its military campaign in Lebanon against Hezbollah, which is Iran's primary armed proxy in the region. And this created a fundamental problem for the ceasefire framework. Here's the problem. Iran has said very clearly that any peace deal with Washington has to include an end to Israeli operations in Lebanon. Iran cannot accept a situation where it agrees to stand down while its allied forces in Lebanon are being decimated. That's both a strategic and a domestic political impossibility for Tehran. If Iran's leadership agrees to a deal that allows Hezbollah to be destroyed, they lose enormous credibility not just internationally, but at home. They look like they abandoned their allies the moment the pressure got too intense. So Iran is tying the Lebanon situation to any peace agreement with America. Israel, on the other hand, has made the exact opposite argument. Israel's position is that its campaign in Lebanon is a completely separate conflict, that what happens between Israel and Hezbollah has nothing to do with the US-Iran nuclear talks, and that linking the two is just Iran's way of giving itself an escape clause from any deal. Now, think about this from a purely strategic standpoint. If you're Iran, of course you want to link the issues. That's maximum leverage. If you're Israel, of course you want them separated. That's also maximum freedom of action. Neither position is irrational, but they are irreconcilable unless someone makes a compromise. And right now, nobody appears willing to do that. And here's where the United States finds itself in a genuinely awkward position. America has two imperatives that are pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there's the desire, or at least the stated desire, to reach a deal with Iran that freezes the nuclear program and reduces hostilities in the Gulf. That deal would require convincing Iran that the Lebanon situation will be addressed. On the other side, there's America's relationship with Israel, which is one of the most complex and politically sensitive bilateral relationships in the world. Pushing Israel to halt its Lebanon operations is politically costly for any American administration, and this one in particular has shown no appetite for doing so. So you have this structural impasse. America wants a deal with Iran, but won't stop Israel. Iran wants a deal with America, but won't sign without Israel stopping. And Israel says it's not part of the conversation. It's like trying to solve a triangle by only talking to two of the three corners. Now, let's go back to the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the global stakes become really vivid. Iran first closed the strait in the early days of this conflict. Then, there was a brief moment where the restrictions were lifted, possibly as a good faith gesture during the ceasefire period, or possibly because Iran calculated it had made its point and didn't want to absorb the full economic blowback of keeping it shut. But then, the US imposed a blockade on Iranian ports. That changed the calculus entirely. When you blockade someone's ports, you're choking their economy. You're preventing their exports from leaving and their imports from arriving. That's an act of economic warfare. Iran's response to the port blockade was to reinstate the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Tit for tat, but with global consequences. And now we're back to a closed strait. Oil prices are elevated, food prices are elevated. Every nation that imports energy through that passage, Japan, South Korea, India, China, Germany, is already feeling the impact. India, notably, has its own problem with this conflict that's separate from the energy question. There were Indian sailors aboard vessels that were struck in the Hormuz region. India reportedly summoned the US envoy over attacks on a ship carrying Indian crew members, with some reported missing. That tells you how broad the fallout from this conflict is becoming. It's no longer just an American or Iranian problem. It's dragging in South Asian workers, East Asian economies, and European energy consumers. One possible explanation for why the U.S. resumed strikes even after the ceasefire is that Washington concluded the ceasefire was being used by Iran strategically, not as a genuine pause toward peace, but as breathing room. If that assessment is accurate, then from a purely military strategic standpoint, the argument would be, apply pressure now before Iran reconsolidates its position. Force a deal rather than wait for one. There's a certain logic to that, but there's also an enormous risk. Because every time there's an exchange of strikes, there's an escalation in rhetoric. And every escalation in rhetoric makes it harder for either side to de-escalate without looking like they're backing down. Nobody wants to be seen as blinking first. Not Washington, not Tehran. And here's something that doesn't get discussed enough in the mainstream coverage: the domestic political dynamics on both sides. In the United States, there are real political pressures surrounding this conflict. Trump has framed this as a decisive confrontation with a long-standing adversary, and that framing plays well with certain constituencies. But there are also rising concerns about the cost of continued military operations, not just in money, but in regional stability, in alliance management, and in the risk of a conflict that expands beyond the Gulf. For Iran, the political stakes are equally intense. Pezeshkian is a president who ran on a more moderate platform, who was seen as someone who might be able to open dialogue with the West. But he's operating within a system where the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, have enormous influence, and the IRGC's instinct is not to negotiate from weakness. The hardliners in Tehran will see every U.S. strike as proof that America cannot be trusted and that dialogue is pointless. So the strikes don't just hit buildings. They hit the political standing of moderates inside Iran who might otherwise push for a deal. Now think about what this conflict is doing to the broader regional architecture. Bahrain and Kuwait, two U.S. allies, are now directly in the crossfire. Their air bases have been targeted. That puts the Gulf Cooperation Council states in an impossible position. These are countries that host American forces, that rely on U.S. security guarantees, but that also have significant economic relationships with Iran, and that are acutely aware of their geographic proximity to Tehran. They cannot afford to be seen as belligerents in a U.S.-Iran war. They cannot afford to have their infrastructure destroyed. And yet, they're already being targeted. It appears that Iran views these host nation agreements as making those countries complicit in U.S. operations, and therefore legitimate targets. Whether or not one agrees with that logic, it's the logic being applied, and it has enormous implications for how Gulf states calculate their own security going forward. Here's where it gets interesting from a longer-term power politics perspective. For decades, the Gulf states have depended on the U.S. security umbrella as their primary protection. That arrangement has always involved a trade-off. You host American forces, you buy American weapons, you align your foreign policy broadly with Washington's, and in return, you get the protection of the world's most powerful military. But what happens when hosting those forces makes you a target? What happens when the presence of American bases on your soil means that your territory becomes a battlefield in someone else's war? That's not a hypothetical question anymore. It's happening right now. And smart strategists in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City are absolutely watching this and thinking about what it means for the future of their security arrangements. There's also the question of China in all of this. Beijing has been conspicuously quiet publicly, but you can be absolutely certain that Chinese strategic planners are watching every development in the Strait of Hormuz with intense focus. China is one of the biggest importers of Gulf oil. The disruption of that supply chain is a direct economic challenge to China. At the same time, China has positioned itself in recent years as a potential mediator in regional conflicts. It brokered the Saudi-Iran rapprochement a few years ago, which was widely seen as a moment of Chinese diplomatic ascendancy. If the US and Iran are trading strikes while negotiations stall, there is a window, however narrow, for some kind of Chinese or multilateral diplomatic intervention. Whether China wants to use that window and whether the US would accept it is another question entirely. But the geopolitical space is there. Russia is another actor worth noting. Russia has its own complex relationship with Iran. They've been partners in Syria. They've been deepening economic and military ties in the context of Western sanctions on Russia. And Moscow certainly has no interest in seeing Iran defeated or destabilized in a way that would result in a pro-Western realignment of the region. But Russia also has its own complicated interests in oil prices. Higher oil prices benefit Russian exports, but a full collapse of Gulf shipping infrastructure creates unpredictability that even Moscow might not want. Some analysts suggest that Moscow is watching this situation carefully, perhaps even quietly encouraging Iranian firmness, precisely because a prolonged conflict keeps oil prices elevated and keeps Washington's strategic attention focused on the Middle East rather than on Eastern Europe. And then there's the nuclear question, which is perhaps the most consequential long-term issue underneath all of this. The indirect talks between the US and Iran were specifically designed to separate the nuclear program from the immediate hostility question. The idea was, first, stop the shooting, then deal with the nukes. But here's the problem with that framework. Every round of escalation makes the nuclear question more urgent, not less. If Iran's leadership concludes that the only thing that would truly deter future American strikes is having a nuclear deterrent, that conclusion becomes more tempting with each bombing run. Iran's nuclear program has been a central concern for decades precisely because of this logic. Conventional military power doesn't deter the United States the way nuclear capability does. Now, Iran has consistently denied that it's pursuing nuclear weapons, and international monitors have noted varying levels of enrichment activity over the years. But the political incentive structure created by ongoing military conflict pushes in a particular direction, and it's not toward disarmament. This is important. The harder the US pushes militarily, the more certain factions within Iran's leadership structure will argue that accommodation leads to destruction, and that the only real security is through deterrence. That's not an Iranian phenomenon. It's a lesson that states around the world have absorbed from observing what happened in Iraq and Libya, two countries that either gave up or didn't develop nuclear programs and were subsequently subjected to regime change or severe military strikes. North Korea has not faced the same fate, and the reason widely cited for that difference is the nuclear deterrent. Iranian strategists are acutely aware of this comparison. So what does all of this mean going forward? One possible trajectory is that the pressure campaign works, that Iran, facing continued military strikes, infrastructure damage, and economic strangulation through the port blockade, eventually decides that the cost of continued resistance exceeds the benefit and agrees to a deal that satisfies enough of Washington's core demands. That deal might involve significant concessions on the nuclear program, perhaps even suspension of enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief and asset unfreezing. If that happens, it would be a significant diplomatic achievement, though the question of Lebanon and Hezbollah would still need to be managed somehow. Another possible trajectory is that the escalation continues on its current path, tit-for-tat strikes becoming gradually more severe, with the Strait of Hormuz remaining effectively closed, oil prices continuing to climb, and the global economic damage mounting to a point where third parties, whether China, European powers, or international bodies, begin applying significant pressure on both sides to return to the table. In this scenario, the deal eventually gets made, but only after considerably more damage has been done, both physical and economic. A third trajectory, and one that serious analysts are not ruling out, is that escalation spins past the point of control. An accidental strike on the wrong target, a miscalculation about the other side's red lines, a domestic political crisis in either country that forces leaders into a more aggressive posture than they would otherwise choose. Any of these could take a manageable confrontation and turn it into something much larger and harder to stop. The history of warfare is full of conflicts that neither side originally intended to fight at the scale they ended up fighting. What's certain right now is that the world is watching a live, real-time test of how the international system handles great power-adjacent conflict in a critical choke point. The rules, norms, and institutions that were supposed to govern these situations, the UN Security Council, international maritime law, ceasefire agreements, are all being tested, and right now, they appear to be under enormous strain. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been limited since before these latest escalations. Oil prices and food prices globally have already moved, and we're still, by any honest assessment, far from a resolution. The indirect talks are slow. The sticking points are real. The domestic politics on both sides make compromise genuinely difficult. And meanwhile, the strikes keep coming. Look, here's the bottom line. This is not a story about two countries fighting over a stretch of water. This is a story about the limits of diplomacy under fire, about the economic architecture that underpins the modern world, about the future of the nuclear non-proliferation order, and about whether great power competition in the 21st century is going to be managed or whether it's going to be allowed to drift toward outcomes that nobody, Not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Beijing or Moscow or Brussels actually wants. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. 1/5 of the world's energy supply is bottled up. American bases in Bahrain and Kuwait have been struck. Tankers are being hit. And the talks that were supposed to prevent all of this are moving slower than the conflict itself. That, guys, is where we are. And everyone should be paying attention.